The sixth generation for video game consoles is probably the most creative time period we've ever had in gaming. Whether it's the games themselves coming up with some wacky and out there ideas, while also taking advantage of the more powerful consoles that were innovative on their own. Whether it's the fact that you could have DVD playback for a system, internal hard drives, the ability to connect to the internet through way of a LAN port that came out of the box on the original Xbox. But along with those, we did have some features with the controllers that were pretty interesting. And one in particular for Microsoft, well, this is the only time they've ever tried this with their own Xbox system. They left it behind after this generation. It's been pretty much forgotten about altogether. And in some ways, it kind of makes sense, but I thought today we would take a look at this obscure feature in Microsoft's console timeline. So if you guys enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe if you're new. It was pretty clear Microsoft looked around at the competition in the lead up to the release of their Xbox console, seeing the move to CDs and DVDs, as well as the push for online gaming with Sega setting the stage with their Dreamcast, was kept in mind for the 2001 holiday launch for Xbox. Something that was less obvious, though, had to do with their controller. And no, I'm not talking about how the original Xbox launch controller was massive. That was eventually resolved a couple years later with the S-type controller after every magazine and early message board online made fun of it. What I'm talking about is the way the controller works with its button presses. Something that was never really advertised about the Xbox was it had pressure-sensitive buttons for A, B, X, Y, along with both black and white. Sony did a lot to market this with the PS2, even listing it on the back of the games that would use the feature. Microsoft never seemed to list pressure sensitive on the back of their games or come up with a different marketing term for it. Because of this, it does sort of feel like an afterthought and made things a bit more difficult for this video to find games that even use the feature. That said, I did come across a few titles that use pressure-sensitive inputs that we'll go through, but first, let's take apart a controller and see how this is all working. I have this Xbox controller that came with a broken system off of eBay. I fixed the system and eventually turned it into a heavily modded console that we're using today to play some games, but unfortunately the controller was too far gone. It just doesn't respond at all, and it's pretty gross, so we'll just use it here for the teardown. You know what I did like quite a bit back with the release of the Xbox? This breakaway cable. It seems pretty basic when you first see it, but I feel like it saved my console at least once or twice. See, if your system is sitting up on a dresser somewhere, you would have controller cords running across your room, and if someone runs through it, the cable will unplug and won't pull your console down. And this is something that did happen back in the day. Not really needed now, though, with wireless controllers, but it was genuinely useful in the last generation with corded controllers out of the box. Anyway, it's just a couple of Phillips head screws around the back of the controller, along with one hiding under the sticker at the bottom. With the back off, we can see the front of the controller board has some black tape covering the points that the buttons push down on. I removed it, and you can see a similar method that we covered with the PS2. If you compare it to the D-pad connections, you can see how much different it is. The idea here is we have a rounded surface on the back of the button membrane that connects these different points depending on how hard you press down. As you push down, you flatten that rounded connector and complete more of the connection on the board. It's not perfect since it is difficult to tell how hard you need to press down to get these different levels of pressure, but technically it does work, and games can track several degrees of input on any of these face buttons. So I decided to look around and see if I could find a list of games that support pressure-sensitive buttons on the Xbox, but there really isn't much coverage on it. I found a few forum threads where people were going over games they remember having pressure-sensitive inputs, so I decided to pick out a few games here and check them out. Also, I'm skipping the most obvious one with Metal Gear Solid 2 Substance since it's really well known from the PS2 and it works the same way here, but I know if I don't at least mention it, a bunch of the comments will just be pointing this one out anyway, so there you go. Okay, let's start with Sega GT 2002. During the 6th generation, the PS2 would use the pressure-sensitive buttons on the front to control acceleration, so you could do things like feather the throttle in races. Sure, it worked, but it was incredibly uncomfortable for long play sessions since you would have to press down really hard to go as fast as possible. Sega GT kept that same control scheme with A accelerating you forward and allowing you to change how aggressive you would accelerate based on how hard you press the button. Here's the issue though, it also offered a significantly better control scheme. just using the right trigger. This basically made all other control setups unnecessary, outside of course, investing in a racing wheel setup, but this made the triggers for the Xbox controller the best way to play racing games out of the box that generation. A racing game released later in the generation, like Burnout 3 Takedown, for example, didn't even have a control setup to use the face buttons for acceleration. That was just completely set to the right trigger, and the A button was there for boosting. Next up, we have Fable, which I did play through this game when it was released, and I don't remember this at all in my playthrough, although it was 20 years ago at this point. Basically, when you draw back your bow, you can control how much you pull back on that arrow with how hard you press down the X button. It's funny because even now, we use bows to show off analog trigger effects with something like the PS5, but yeah, we've been doing this for decades now. Not much else to really say here. It works fine for the most part, and I can control the bow speed well enough this way. It does feel like the Xbox buttons are not as responsive though as its PS2 counterpart, but that could also be down to the controller condition, since even a good-looking controller is still dealing with buttons that are decades old at this point. Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance lets you aim your bow before firing an arrow by pressing down slowly. This one was pretty difficult to get the correct pressure figured out, and it isn't going to do much in the heat of battle. Also, this game, still fun. I remember playing this over at a friend's house, and I thought the visuals were impressive then, and it still looks clean now for this generation, but the co-op part was such a blast running around Diablo style on the same screen, taking out enemies and leveling up. Dark Alliance 2 is the one most people go to, and with good reason. It's just a better game, but this one still has a special place for me that is, yes, completely held up by nostalgia. Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball. So here's something I didn't expect. This game is actually the best use of analog controller buttons that I've seen. Right away, you can see in the options, we can actually change the sensitivity for the pressure needed to go between soft or hard presses. This, by the way, can be changed on the fly in the middle of a match. If you move the digital inputs, you can see it just puts all 4 buttons into play for hard or soft hits. I do think in this case, sticking with the analog inputs is better. I found that when I would go to spike the ball, I was generally pressing pretty hard on the button anyway, and vice versa for setting where I would end up pressing lightly. It just works to simplify inputs down to 2 buttons. The pull hopping minigame also uses the pressure sensitive buttons, where a light press makes you jump 1 spot and a heavy press makes you jump 2 spots. I noticed a bunch of mispresses here, and I tried to play around with the sensitivity, but it just still wasn't very accurate most times. Even so, nothing compares to what is probably the worst implementation of this feature on the Xbox, Dead or Alive 2 Ultimate. It's already difficult to string together combos and fine-tune the timing in these games, but now adding a new element of a button being able to activate 3 different punches or kicks, depending on how hard it's pressed, is something that it sounds good on paper. It would be a way to turn 1 button into 3 and add a new layer of intricacy to the experience. Unfortunately, when actually used in the game, it's terrible. Getting the feel just right and having your fighter execute what you want is incredibly difficult, since the sensitivity here is really inconsistent. You can see it easily in the sparring mode with the button input shown at the bottom left. A regular button icon is a light press, an icon with 1 line is medium, and 2 lines is heavy. I found that getting the light attack was the most difficult, and eventually realized that by putting my thumb halfway on the button, it made it more consistent to hit. But no one is going to do that in a game about precision like a fighting game. The most useful is probably the different grabs, since you can perform them with light, medium, or heavy, working to reposition your opponent. Fortunately, this is optional, and you can turn off the analog button presses in the settings menu. In fact, this was off by default for me when I turned the game on, which is probably for the best. I do wonder, though, how many people played this game and never realized there was a control scheme that was available like this to use. Maybe somewhere out there is a master of using the pressure-sensitive buttons and just never loses, since I can see the vision here, but the execution just muddies everything up. By the time the Xbox 360 released just 4 years later, the pressure-sensitive buttons were gone, and I can see why. It was something that wasn't used much, and when a game did try to tap into the feature, it was usually half-baked or was easily replaced with the triggers on the back. No game was built around the feature specifically, and even something like Metal Gear Solid 2's use was figured out for the 360 HD release later on. Still though, it's just a reminder that at the time, Microsoft was the new kid on the block and seemed to throw everything at the wall to see what stuck. This just happened to be an idea that they explored for a few years with their first console and then immediately left it behind. I guess nowadays you don't really see pressure-sensitive buttons at all, mostly for the face buttons. You still have your triggers that are analog, and makes a lot of sense based on what we've seen just through the evolution of these different consoles and controllers. But still, there were some genuinely interesting ideas that came from these pressure-sensitive face buttons, but it's something that pretty much is going to be living in the past going forward. But let me know what you guys thought about this down below. Hey, let me know if you were even aware that at one point in time, Microsoft did have pressure-sensitive buttons similar to what Sony did with the PlayStation 2 and the PlayStation 3. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.